Next presentation is by Massimo Pulejo, Pro-Social Backlash, the effect of far-right success on voluntary welfare provision, and the rules are as before.
Thanks a lot for the invitation. Thanks Luca and Carlo and all the organization and the foundation for first of all, the support to my research, and then the opportunity to present today. This was a project that I started when I was a PhD student at New York University, and now I'm a postdoc at the University of Milan and the Clean Center here at Bocconi. So let me jump straight into the motivation for this project, which is first of all political, right? I mean, we have been talking about what's going on in Europe these days, but we know that essentially all over the world there's been an increasing success of populist party in political competition, right? Which meant that essentially these parties went from being fringe parties, minor parties that had a hard time going into double digits, to being parties that are often into executive power at the national and at the local level, right? And this is, of course, much more a phenomenon that it's going on the right wing of the political spectrum, as we know from Italy and from many other Western democracies. So given that, you know, these populists are having all these electoral success, among other things that we may want to understand on these dynamics, we may care about what these kind of electoral outcomes are triggering among citizens. So are people going to react in some attitudinal or behavioral way that it's interesting under a socioeconomic point of view? And the literature in both, you know, political science, sociology, and to some extent economics tells us that there should be two main kinds of reactions when an extremist party wins an election. One, it's a reaction of legitimization, and one, it's a reaction of backlash, right? So legitimization essentially means that people who were previously supporters of these extremist views and tended to kind of hide and not participate so much or in an overt way into the political debate are going to feel legitimized, in fact, to express their opinions, which, you know, when it comes to far-right ideals, might be opinions of xenophobia, among others, right? And there is a strong, in fact, evidence empirically from several studies that this is the case among far-right supporters. So they become essentially more comfortable at expressing their opinions or even at using violent behavior against the groups that they dislike. On the other hand, when it comes to the victory of progressive parties, there is a strong evidence of backlash. So essentially here the idea is that when a progressive idea wins or a progressive party moves to power, conservatives, and especially, you know, far-right conservatives, they tend to contrast in a violent way the success of these more progressive views that they do not share. What we are missing, at least, you know, in terms of concrete empirical studies, it's evidence of backlash against the success of the far-right. So when the left wins, the far-right mobilizes as a reaction. But when the far-right wins, what do progressive people do? Okay, so this is in a nutshell what I try to understand in this study by looking at one possible kind of reaction, okay? Which is mobilizing in support of people who are endangered by the far-right. So here is one example that maybe some of you remember after the electoral victory of Donald Trump in the US in 2016, and the fact that the president started almost immediately to sign a bunch of executive orders against immigrants, refugees, and people coming from a specific area of the world, mostly the Middle East, there was a big mobilization of progressive activists in the country to the defense of these people. So this, for instance, is a group of lawyers that mobilized and went to the JFK airport of New York in order to help immigrants and refugee asylum seekers signing their request for asylum, okay? So what we don't know is whether these kind of episodes are, you know, the harbingers of a systematic phenomenon. Is this something that is happening at a bigger scale, or just a bunch of, you know, maybe nice stories, but that's it. So what I try to understand in this study is there going to be, first of all, a behavioral reaction from progressive people to the victory of a far-right party? If yes, what are the mediators, right? So what are the factors that could favor this kind of reaction or that could hinder this kind of reaction? And then finally, what could be the impact of this kind of reaction for the socioeconomic landscape of our community? So what do I do concretely to go into the study? I use Italy as my case study, and I study years from 2005 to 2020, so recent years. Empirically, I use a regression discontinuity design. I look at municipal elections in which the far right wins by a narrow margin, okay? And my main dependent variable of interest is gonna be the change in the stock of local volunteering associations. So what I try to understand is whether there is a change, and specifically whether there is an increase in the amount of welfare provision at the local level following the election of a far-right mayor, okay? That's the study in a nutshell. So what I find, it's that the victory of a far-right mayor leads to a 10% increase in the size of the local volunteering sector in terms of number of associations per 1,000 inhabitants. This increase is entirely driven by one specific type of association. We know that the third sector is broad. Associations tend to do many things. But this increase that I find in the data, it's driven by social welfare organizations, which are those that provide poverty relief for the poor in general, but in many cases for foreigners, okay? This is concentrated in places in which the far-right mayor wins as the challenger. Why is this important? Because this means that essentially this is a reaction to a political shock. When the election is electing a far-right mayor again, so this is not novel at the local level, we don't see this kind of dynamic. The effect is driven by places in which the far-right is winning for the first time. And then, going into some survey data, I also show that this reaction is driven by the willingness of people who self-define as progressive to join these associations, okay? So the hypotheses that I'm going to bring to the data, which are driven from the literature that I just cited a few minutes ago, are that if there is a backlash, then far-right victories should lead to an expansion of the local volunteering sector, because these local volunteering associations, they can essentially fill a gap in terms of social welfare provision, that this should be driven by those associations that are in the position to fill this gap, right? That this is stronger in the cases in which the election result comes as a surprise, and then finally that this is driven by people who oppose the ideas of the far right. Okay, so I'm gonna bring all these four hypotheses to the data, and now I'm gonna try to provide a brief summary of what I do. So, to this audience, I don't really need to provide so much of a background in terms of the case study. So we know that in Italy, municipalities are a very important tier of the administration, and they provide a lot of services to their citizens, including, among others, social welfare, just such as, childcare, income support, and so on and so forth. The far right has been gaining power on top of at the national level, also at the local level in Italy. So you see from my data that at least one coalition with the far right party was present in about a fifth of all the mayoral races in Italy. And this percentage is much bigger in relatively bigger towns. So about 3/4 of towns above 15,000 inhabitants, they had at least one far right party competing for the mayoral seat in the period of my analysis. And we all know that the flagship proposals of the Italian far right are, in terms of economic policy, fiscal policy, essentially regressive tax reform. We can think about the flat tax. And in terms of immigration policy, they are promoting a restrictive stance on immigration. The dependent variable is going to be about volunteering associations, so also here not so much to explain to this audience, but I study what we call organizzazioni di volontariato in Italy. So these organizations are mostly funded by the private sector. There is a component that comes from the public, but the bulk it's coming from private donors. What do I do operationally? I use regional registries, so I registri del terzo settore, to create a panel data set with almost 400,000 observations at the association year level, right? Which cover more than 27,000 organizations starting from 1991. Crucially, in the data, I have information on the sector of operation of these associations, okay? Which is divided into these categories. So social welfare, which plays, the lion's share, 55%, healthcare provision, civil rights, cultural entertainment, and environmental protection, okay? So I'm gonna focus on this social welfare bracket, which as you can see, it's pretty big, and here comes the support of Fondazione Franceschi, which I used to hire research assistants to help me essentially focus on those associations in this big bucket that provide poverty relief. So excluding associations, for instance, that work with, disabled people, that they are the so-called socio-sanitarie and so on and so forth, trying to focus on those that help the poor, essentially providing mostly food, shelter, education. And all of these associations, they also work for immigrants and refugees, okay? So the empirical strategy, I don't want to be too technical here, but it's going to be a regression discontinuity design. So as I said before, the bulk of the idea is I'm going to compare what happens in the 5-year following the election in a municipality in which the far-right coalition wins by a whisker, wins by a few percentage points perhaps, with municipalities in which there is a far-right coalition running, but this coalition loses by a whisker. Okay, and the assumption here is that if these municipalities are similar in a bunch of other respects, then the result of the election can be seen as a coin flip, as a randomized assignment of the political affiliation of the mayor, okay? So let's go to the first hypothesis that I mentioned. So I first want to understand whether there is this kind of backlash. So is it true in the context of my study that far-right victories, they lead to an expansion of the local volunteering sector? So with my identification strategy, it makes sense to look at this, first of all, graphically. So what you're seeing in this graph, it's at a very narrow bracket close to, a tie, essentially. What happens in cases, here in green, in which the far-right wins by a narrow margin versus cases in which the far-right loses by a narrow margin. And you can see that there is a jump in the size of the local volunteering sector. So the number of associations per capita over the next 5 years increases in places in which the far-right won by this narrow margin. And we can look at this in a less colorful way by looking at this regression table, which also helps us understand the magnitude of the effect. So what's going on here, it's essentially an 11 percentage points increase, an 11% increase in the stock of associations, which, in more concrete terms means for every 15,000 inhabitants, there is an additional social welfare association that comes up, okay? Then the second part of my hypothesis was that among the different kinds of associations, those that work to help the people who are in danger by the far right, they should be driving the effect, right? So this should not be about, cultural entertainment or environmental protection. This should be about a specific sector within the third sector. So we can look at this by essentially repeating the analysis, distinguishing the associations by their sector of operation. And we see that the positive and significant coefficient, the first one, it's for the social welfare sector, and we do not see a comparable effect for any of the other categories, which we might consider here as a placebo categories. So this is really about social welfare improvements. Then the third hypothesis was that if this is a backlash, if this is a reaction to what's going on, then the reactions should be stronger if the result of the election, it's more of a shock for the local community. When could we think about this as a shock? In the case in which the far-right is gaining power rather than winning again. So the far-right is accessing local power for the first time. So we can repeat the analysis separately for places in which the previous mayor was already supported by the far-right versus places in which the previous mayor was not supported by the far-right, okay? And if we do so, we see that this is the results. So in blue, places in which the far-right was the incumbent, the effect is essentially not distinguishable from zero, whereas both for the generality of associations and for social welfare association, in red, you can see that the positive effect only comes up in places in which the far-right is winning the mayoral seat. Okay, and then finally, these results, perhaps, hopefully, interesting, they are all at the aggregate level, meaning at the municipality level, so they are a bit of a black box. What's going on behind the scenes? So who are the people who are driving this reaction? So here the literature suggests that this reaction should be, coming from people that do not share the views of the far right. Of course, the backlash cannot come from supporters of the far right. It should come from people that oppose the ideas and the policies. So in order to understand whether this is the case, I need to go at the individual level. So I use 4 rounds of the ITANES survey, which is a survey pretty popular. Many of you probably know about it. I go a bit back in time, because 2001, 2013, it's the bracket of time in which they have data at the municipality level, okay? And they ask, among many other things, whether the respondent is part of a volunteering association, and of what kind of association, okay? So I use this empirical specification. In this case, I'm looking at a simple two-way fixed effects model, and I know whether the person who is responding to the survey self-declared to be a left-leaning, politically left-leaning, or politically right-leaning person. So essentially, I can compare the responses of people who are left versus right-leaning at times in which their municipality is governed by the far right versus time in which their municipality is not governed by the far right. So it's essentially a 2-by-2 comparison, okay? And the idea here is, if the backlash is indeed driven by people who oppose the far right, we should see that left-leaning respondents living under a far right government, they should be more willing to join this association, if that makes sense. So we can look at this with this simple graph. So again, in blue we have left-leaning individuals. When they are under a far-right mayoral spell, they are more likely to join the social welfare sector, so to participate in the activities of a local association that provides social welfare, but not a local association that provides cultural entertainment, which has not much to do with the type of dynamics that we have in mind. And instead, in red, you see that for people on the right of the political spectrum, not much is going on in any case. Okay, so let me just wrap up by saying that, you know, what I try to show in these studies, that far-right success can lead to a behavioral reaction from opposers of the far right. And in particular, I demonstrate this in the context of social welfare volunteering. My findings show that reactions to the far right are not limited to shifts in opinions that were already gauged and presented by previous empirical studies, which were mostly about, you know, opinion surveys. Here I'm looking at a concrete behavioral reaction. I think that this opens up, you know, some avenues for future research, and in particular, it would be interesting to see whether this counter-mobilization is also there in other sectors of public life on top of the third sector. And also, you know, admittedly, especially the part with survey data was not very fine-grained, was not very granular, so it would be interesting to design ad hoc surveys in order to study the dynamics at the individual level, possibly panel surveys that can follow the very same people across different years and see what they do depending on the political climate in the place that they live. Thanks a lot.
Any question?
Yes. Any qualitative difference between the two backlash? It seems that the left-wing one is in terms of social associations and so on, and the other one is more limited to the political sphere, you know. Is that because you have analyzed only few things, or you think that this is a general statement?
I mean, in this particular study, I focus on a backlash to a far-right victory, and I show that, as you said, this is not necessarily a political backlash. This is a backlash in terms of, you know, engagement. Most of extant studies that studied backlash against the left, they were about a political backlash. So protesting, trying to, you know, essentially gain the power in the next election and so on. I don't think that we know whether this kind of backlash it's only political or it can be something else, simply because all of the studies that are out there, they always look at these political outcomes. It would be interesting to understand whether also far-right people, they can organize into associations, they can do something that is different from protesting, but the answer to your question is, so far we don't know, because there is no study, but I think it's possible. Yeah.
I have two questions or maybe suggestions for future research. The first one is whether this mobilization is more reaction or substitution. And I think you can address this by looking at budget at the municipal level. and would be interesting. And the other thing is, I understand that you need a causal identification, but I'm curious if you can look at the full spectrum of possible shift of. So the issue is that if you look at municipality that just change for few votes, in this municipality the share of anti or right society is very large. So even if I agree that you cannot claim causality, you can look at the full spectrum of results to have the flavor of what's going on.
No, I agree, if I have time to quickly answer. So I agree with you on the second point, and I already have the answer actually in the data.
Okay.
But so what the data is showing us is that if you move away from the cutoff, which means if you move into like cases in which the far right wins by a lot, this reaction is muted, which I think makes perfect sense with your kind of idea, which is if you don't have a sufficiently large critical mass, then this reaction cannot happen. And then about the first one, I'm trying to work with data on what these municipalities do, right? So in terms of budget data, they are not very detailed because they only tell you, okay, this is what we are spending on social welfare, but social welfare, it's a lot of different things. So now I'm working with procurement data, in which you have the title of each contract and you know what the municipality is procuring money for. So there maybe I'm going to have a bit more leverage to distinguish if they are providing less benefits specifically to immigrants, specifically to refugees, which I think it's very likely, but you have to prove it. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Just very quickly. So. Repeat the question.
Yes. So the question was whether there is any geographical heterogeneity, for instance, between the north, the south, the center. So the answer is most of my sample comes from the center north, as you can imagine, because the center north is the area in which, especially, thanks to the Northern League, there were a lot of victories of these far right associations. So most of the effect seems to be concentrated in the center north. But this could be the result of low statistical power to look at the effect in the south, in which you don't have all these mayoral elections won by a far-right coalition. So this is also a limitation of the study. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.